The message came on a Wednesday evening just as the last of the light was fading from my porch. I was sitting in the same wooden chair I've had for years, the one that creaks a little under me, a cup of coffee gone cold on the table beside my hand. My phone buzzed, a text. It was short, 6 words, no greeting, no signature. "Dad, please don't come to the wedding." I read it once, twice, a third time as though some hidden clause might appear if I stared long enough. But the words remained the same. Please don't come. You know, people always imagine heartbreak arrives with thunderclaps, with shouting, slammed doors, or accusations flying through the air. In my experience, it usually comes softly, like this. A few words on a glowing screen that steal the warmth from the room. For a long time, I didn't move. The cicadas hummed in the trees. The evening smelled faintly of cut grass. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the block. But inside my chest, there was only silence, heavy as stone. I thought of the boy I raised, my only son. I remembered his first day of school, his hand gripping mine so tight I had to pry each finger loose. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bike on this very street, running beside him until my legs gave out and he coasted ahead, laughing. I remembered sitting in the bleachers at his high school graduation, clapping until my palms stung. I remembered all the nights after his mother passed, just me and him in the small house, a father fumbling with laundry and spaghetti sauce, doing his best to be 2 parents in one. We leaned on each other like 2 halves of a tent, neither of us standing without the other. And now he was telling me not to come. At first, I wanted to believe it was a mistake. Maybe his fiancée had grabbed his phone. Maybe he'd been pressured into writing something he didn't mean. But even as I told myself that story, I knew the truth. My son had chosen her side. It's funny, people think rejection is loud, but the cruelest rejection comes quietly with no chance to defend yourself. There was no argument, no chance to ask why. Just a verdict, stay away. I set the phone down and stared at my reflection in the darkened window. An old man with tired eyes stared back. Wrinkles etched by years of work, shoulders rounded not by defeat but by decades of carrying weight no one else saw. Was I so embarrassing to him? So unworthy? I picked up the phone again, scrolled back through our last messages. Months of silence. The occasional update, busy dad, can't talk right now. Will come by soon. Promises that never happened. Somewhere along the way, a wall had risen between us and I hadn't noticed until it was too tall to see over. I typed 3 words in reply, "Are you sure?" The dots appeared, then vanished, appeared again. Finally, a new line blinked on the screen. "Yes, please respect this. It's what she wants. It's what she wants." There it was, the truth dressed in politeness. My son's voice, but not his will, the echo of someone else's judgment. I put the phone down and stood, walking into the yard. The sky had turned the color of rust. Fireflies floated like lost sparks above the grass. I breathed deeply, trying to steady the tremor in my chest. You can't force someone to want you, not even your own child. That's a bitter lesson, but a necessary one. Still, I thought of the wedding. The music, the laughter, the toasts. Strangers and in-laws celebrating on land that held more of my sweat than any ballroom ever could. A land I had cleared myself years ago, acre by acre, with calloused hands and a back that never seemed to straighten. The irony was almost cruel. They could uninvite me from the ceremony, but the ground beneath their feet, that still had my name on it. I didn't plan revenge that night. I didn't plan anything at all. I simply sat back down on the porch and let the darkness settle in. I thought of my late wife, how she would have known what to say. She always had the right words when my anger got the better of me, when pride threatened to choke reason. But she wasn't here, only me. An old man with a phone in his hand and a message that had cut deeper than any blade. And so I whispered into the night as though she could still hear me. "Looks like they don't want me there, sweetheart, but maybe it's not their choice to make." The wind stirred the trees, the house creaked. Somewhere deep inside, a seed was planted. I didn't know then what it would grow into, only that something had shifted, because sometimes exclusion isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning. The morning after the message, I found myself awake before the sun. The habit of rising early never left me, not even after retirement. My body was trained by decades of labor, of watching dawn crack over fields I once worked with my own hands. But that morning I didn't feel the quiet peace I usually felt with the first light. Instead, I felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out. I brewed coffee and let it sit untouched. The steam curled upward, then faded as though even it couldn't bear to stay. I should have gone about my day, mowed the yard, repaired the loose hinge on the shed, simple tasks that keep an old man steady. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone, half expecting another message. Some kind of apology, a softening. Nothing came. By mid-morning, I drove into town. The diner on Main Street is a place I've been going to for 30 years. Same cracked leather booths, same faded photos of little league teams on the wall. The waitress, Marlene, has poured me more cups of coffee than I could count. "Morning, Dennis," she said, setting down the mug without asking. "Morning," I answered. My voice must have carried something different, because she studied me longer than usual. "You look like a man who got bad news." I smiled, or tried to. Maybe just news I didn't want to hear. She didn't press. That's the gift of small-town folk. They know when to pry and when to let silence do its work. I sat there a while, letting the hum of conversations and the clatter of dishes ground me. Across from me, a young couple argued gently over wedding invitations, the bride-to-be fanning a stack of envelopes while the groom checked names off a list. Their laughter rose above the clink of silverware, bright and careless. It landed heavy in my chest. I finished the coffee and left before Marlene could offer a refill. The day was warm for spring. I drove without a destination, winding past farms and fields, until the road curved toward the edge of town where the new development stood. What used to be open pasture was now dressed up with white fences, gravel parking lots, and a long, low building with glass doors and rented elegance. I slowed the truck, more out of instinct than curiosity. A sign stood tall by the entrance, painted in green and gold, "Evergreen Hall Weddings and Events." Cars were parked out front, vendors unloading crates of flowers and boxes of linens. Workers hammered stakes into the ground, stringing lights overhead. I pulled over, rolled down the window. That's when I noticed the smaller sign beneath the grand one. The kind no guest ever reads, but one that tells the truth. "Property of Dennis Flores, leased by Evergreen Hall Management." My name. I hadn't thought about it in years. The land had been mine since my father passed, but I'd leased it out when I no longer had the strength to keep livestock. It was easier to let someone else make use of it, and in return the checks came steady. Enough to cover bills, to keep the roof fixed, to pad the savings. Now here it was, polished and transformed. The ground beneath my boots turned into a stage for other people's celebrations. And soon, it seemed, for my sons. I parked and walked closer, keeping to the gravel's edge. Workers bustled about, too busy to question an old man watching. I rested a hand on the fence post, the wood still familiar under my palm, even with its fresh coat of paint. I could picture it already, the music, the guests in pressed suits and silk dresses, the vows spoken beneath the canopy. My son standing there, smiling for photographs, beginning his life with a woman who thought I wasn't fit to be seen. I felt the sting of it, sharper than the text message. To be erased from the ceremony was one thing, but to be erased on land that bore my name, that was another matter. I stayed there a long time, long enough for one of the men unloading crates to glance my way. "You here for the wedding, sir?" he asked politely. I shook my head. "Just passing by." He nodded and went back to work, but I wasn't passing by. I was standing on a piece of myself, the ground that tied me to this town, to my father before me, to every calloused hand that had built a life out of soil. They could tell me not to come. They could strip my name from the guest list, but they couldn't strip it from the deed. That night back home, I sat with the papers, the lease agreement, the property tax receipts, the old deed folded carefully inside a manila envelope, my name inked on every page, proof that what I had built, what I had worked for, was still mine. I spread them across the table. Each paper carried its own kind of weight, heavier than stone. I thought again of my wife, the way she used to remind me that kindness didn't mean letting people trample you. She'd say, "There's a difference between generosity and surrender, Dennis. Don't confuse the two." I hadn't. Not until now. The phone buzzed once more that evening. A message from my son. Just a link to the wedding registry. No words attached. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. Then I set it down on the papers. For the first time since that cold message the night before, I felt a steadiness in my chest. Not anger. Not bitterness. Something quieter, stronger. Because I understood this much. They could choose not to see me as a father, But on that land, my land, they would see me whether they liked it or not. The following week, I tried to carry on with life as usual. There were fences to mend on the back lot, gutters to clear before the spring storms, tools scattered in the shed that begged for order. But the truth is, every chore felt hollow. My mind kept circling back to that patch of land now dressed for celebration, and the ceremony that would unfold without me. I didn't tell anyone about the text. Around here, news spreads faster than fire in a dry field, and I wasn't ready to see the pity in people's eyes. Pride is a stubborn thing. It doesn't vanish with age, it just gets heavier. Still, it was impossible to keep my thoughts contained. Late one night, I drove out to the edge of town again, parking where the gravel turned to dirt. Lights glittered along the new structure, strings of bulbs hanging like stars captured and tethered. The hall was nearly ready. Workers carried out rehearsals, tables arranged, music tested, the soft buzz of an event being born. I stayed hidden in the dark, watching. It felt like standing outside a window, seeing a life you used to belong to but no longer recognize. 2 days later, I went to the bank. Not for money, I had enough for my modest life, but for the safe deposit box I hadn't opened in years. The clerk led me to the small room, handed me the thin metal key. Inside the box were old photographs, my wife's wedding ring, a few documents I hadn't looked at since before she passed. And there, folded neatly, was the original deed to the property. My name, ink still bold though the paper had yellowed. I held it in my hands and felt the weight of generations. My father's sweat was in that soil, just as mine was. To see it turned into a place where I was not welcome, it struck me as an insult not only to me, but to every Flores who had broken ground there. I sat in that little room a long while. The air smelled of metal and dust. The hum of the vault echoed faintly, and I thought maybe this isn't just about attending a wedding. Maybe it's about respect, about the invisible thread that ties a son to his father, a family to its roots. I returned the documents to the box, but not before making copies. Something in me whispered that I might need them. The next Sunday I stopped by church. Not for Mass. I wasn't much for services these days, but because Father Mark had known my family since I was a boy. He greeted me at the door with that soft smile of his, the kind that tells you he sees more than you wish to reveal. "You've got something weighing on you," he said, not as a question. I nodded. "You ever feel like the people you love most forget who you are?" He tilted his head, thoughtful. "I think sometimes they don't forget, they just choose not to see. It's easier to build a new picture than to honor the whole truth." I sighed. "And what's a man supposed to do then?" "Stand in his truth," he said, quietly, firmly. "The world has a way of bending around a truth that won't move." I thanked him, though I wasn't sure what to do with his words. They echoed in my head as I walked out, carrying both comfort and challenge. That evening I received another message. This one wasn't from my son, but from his fiancée, Isabella. "Mr. Flores, I think it's best you don't contact Michael again before the wedding. It causes unnecessary stress. We need this day to be about joy, not conflict." "No, dear. No, thank you." Just a directive, clipped and polite, as though I were a contractor who hadn't delivered on time. My hands shook as I read it. I set the phone down, walked outside, and let the cool night air wash over me. For years I had accepted being overlooked, even dismissed, if it meant peace for my boy. But this was different. This was erasure. And erasure, I realized, is a kind of death. I thought of my wife again. She would have hated this silence, this cutting off. She would have stood taller than me, her voice calm but unyielding. She used to tell me, "Dennis, love doesn't mean swallowing disrespect. It means teaching people how to treat you." I whispered her words into the darkness, and for the first time they didn't feel like advice from the past. They felt like a command for the present. The days rolled forward, each one marked with preparations I glimpsed from afar. Trucks hauling decorations, caterers unloading supplies, the skeleton of a wedding being clothed in finery. I kept working my land, the parts that weren't leased out, pruning the orchard, turning the soil for spring planting. My body moved with the rhythm of habit, but my mind was elsewhere. It became clear to me that I couldn't simply stay away. Not because I wanted revenge, not even because I longed to sit at a table and toast my son, but because that land carried my name, my history, and my presence whether they wanted it or not. The wedding would happen on my ground, and if I was to be treated as invisible, I needed to decide how much of myself I would allow them to erase. I didn't yet know what form that decision would take, but as I watched the sun dip behind the hills, setting the fields aglow, I felt a resolve I hadn't known in years. Something was stirring in me, a strength I thought I'd buried with my wife, and it whispered one clear truth: when the day comes, I will be there. The morning sun spilled across my kitchen table, catching the edges of the papers I had left there overnight. Copies of the deed, the lease agreement, tax receipts, all proof of what I owned and what others had forgotten. They weren't just documents to me anymore. They had begun to feel like armor. I sat there with a pen in my hand, tracing the bold letters of my name. Dennis Flores. My father's name before mine and his father's before him. I thought of the hands that had tilled that ground, each generation adding something more. Now my son would stand on it, take vows upon it, and act as though the roots beneath his feet belonged to someone else. It was then the thought arrived, sharp and uninvited: maybe they need reminding, not with shouting, not with fists on tables, but with something undeniable. That afternoon I drove into town again. The post office first, to pick up a certified letter that had been waiting for me. A notice from the management company that leased the hall. They had scheduled a final inspection of the property before the wedding. I folded it carefully into my pocket. Timing was on my side. From there, I stopped at a print shop. The young clerk barely looked up from his computer when I asked for 10 copies of the property records, bound neatly in folders. He stacked them on the counter, heavy enough to make my arms ache as I carried them back to the truck. I imagined setting them down one by one like stones dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading farther than anyone expected. I didn't know yet how I would use them, only that I would. The days grew longer, the air warmer, spring giving way to early summer. Each drive past the venue showed me another layer added: white tents rising like sails, a stage for the band, a canopy of flowers draped across the arch where vows would be spoken. I never saw my son there, though. Only crews of strangers, working under the direction of people who didn't know the history beneath their boots. It was as if Michael had cut himself off entirely, allowing the preparations to stand in place of any real connection. One evening, as I lingered near the fence line, I caught sight of Isabella's parents. They stepped from a black car, dressed in suits and pearls, though it was only rehearsal. They walked the grounds with the manager, pointing, gesturing, laughing with the kind of ease that comes when you believe everything belongs to you. I stayed hidden, though every muscle in me ached to step forward. I wanted to tell them, "You're walking on my father's sweat. You're celebrating on the back of every calloused hand that came before." But I bit my tongue. Words spoken in anger vanish like smoke. Proof laid quietly on a table that lingers. Back at home, I began to prepare in small ways. I pressed my one good suit, dark gray and a little loose now that age had trimmed me down. I polished the shoes I hadn't worn since my wife's funeral. On the dresser, I placed the folders, stacked neatly like a soldier's kit waiting for orders. In the evenings, I talked to her, not out loud, not always, but in my mind. "What would you do?" I asked. Sometimes I thought I heard her laugh, that low chuckle that used to soften my rough edges. "You'd walk in there with your head high, Dennis. You'd let the truth speak for itself." And so that became the plan. Not revenge, spectacle, just truth laid bare. A week before the wedding, Michael finally called. Not a text this time. His voice was thin, tired. "Dad," he said, "I heard you've been hanging around the property." I let the silence stretch. "It's my land, Michael." "I know," he said quickly, as though admitting it might close the wound before it opened wider. "But this is complicated. Isabella, she just wants the day to be perfect. You showing up would, it would ruin everything." Ruin everything. The words stung, though he didn't mean them as a knife. "Michael," I said softly, "a perfect day doesn't come from pretending people don't exist. It comes from honoring what's real." He sighed. "Please, just this once, stay away from me." I almost agreed, almost. But then I looked at the papers spread across the dresser, the weight of history pressed into each page. My father's signature, my name, the sweat and years that had built it all. "I can't promise that," I told him. "Not this time." There was a long pause, then the line went dead. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch until the stars blurred together, my heart heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. Not just a wedding, not just vows spoken, but a reckoning. A moment when truth would step out from the shadows and demand to be seen. And I would be the one to carry it into the light. The week of the wedding arrived with the kind of heat that clings to your skin. The fields shimmered under the sun, the air thick with pollen and the hum of insects. I worked through the mornings, repairing fences and trimming branches, anything to keep my hands busy. But every task felt like a prelude, as though all roads led to the same place, the hall on my land. The invitations had gone out weeks ago, to everyone but me. The town buzzed with talk who was attending, how lavish it would be, what kind of spectacle Isabella's family was planning. At the diner, people leaned across booths to whisper about imported champagne and a band from the city. I kept my head down, stirred my coffee, pretended not to hear. But inside, the words lodged like burrs. It wasn't envy. I had no taste for chandeliers or designer gowns. It was the way my son's wedding had become theater, a show built on appearances, with me written out of the script entirely. 3 days before the ceremony, I drove past the property again. White chairs stood in rows now, neat as soldiers. A floral arch rose at the far end of the aisle, draped in roses that must have cost more than a month's wages. Workers hoisted lanterns into the trees, their ropes creaking in the branches. I stopped at the fence line, resting my hands on the wood. The smell of cut grass drifted over, mixed with the sweetness of the flowers. For a moment, I imagined myself seated among the guests, watching my son take vows, clapping with the rest. A father's place. But then I remembered the message, "Please don't come," and Isabella's curt note, "We need this day to be about joy, not conflict." They weren't building a place for me. They were building a stage to erase me. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I sat at the kitchen table, the stack of folders before me. Each one held pieces of my life, payments made, agreements signed, a quiet history of sacrifice that no one wanted to acknowledge. I poured a glass of water, stared at the papers, and asked the empty room, "What am I doing?" My wife's photograph sat on the shelf above, her smile soft, her eyes steady. I imagined her answer, "You're standing for yourself, Dennis, for the truth. Not to shame them, but to remind them who they are." The words steadied me. I slid the folders into a leather satchel I hadn't used in years, the kind with a buckle that snapped shut like a lock. I set it by the door. Ready. The day before the wedding, Michael came by. I hadn't expected him. His truck pulled into the drive, tires crunching on gravel, and for a moment I thought he might be coming to reconcile. He stepped out in a pressed shirt, his hair trimmed sharp. He looked older than I remembered, shoulders tight with the weight of expectation. "Dad," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Michael." He shifted on his feet, glancing toward the satchel by the door as if it might speak. "I know you feel wronged, but tomorrow is important. For Isabella, for her family, we can't have any disruptions." "Disruptions?" I said, keeping my voice even. "Your father being present at your wedding is a disruption." He winced. "It's not like that, it's complicated." "No," I said, "it's simple. You've chosen to pretend I don't exist, and you want me to play along." His jaw tightened. He looked away toward the fields. "Please, Dad, just this one day, stay home." I wanted to shout, to tell him about every dollar, every hour, every night I stayed awake worrying about him, working for him. But instead I said quietly, "I can't do that, son." He swallowed hard. "Then don't expect me to defend you." And with that he left. The gravel dust rose behind his truck and settled slowly, like the last word in an argument no one wanted to finish. That evening I walked the length of my property. The fields stretched wide and golden, the cicadas buzzing louder as the sun fell. At the far edge I stopped to watch the lights glowing from the hall. Music drifted faintly, a rehearsal underway. Laughter carried on the wind, light and careless. I stood there until the sky turned black, until stars pricked holes in the dark. My satchel hung heavy at my side, filled with paper and proof. But what weighed more was the silence between me and my son, thicker than the night air. Still, beneath the heaviness, there was clarity, the kind that comes when a man knows he has nothing left to lose but his dignity. Tomorrow they would try to erase me. Tomorrow I would show them that roots can't be cut with invitations or silence. The land remembered, the papers remembered, and so would I. The morning of the wedding broke quiet and pale. A mist clung low over the fields, softening the horizon, making the fences look as though they floated in the air. I rose before the sun, not because I'd planned to, but because sleep had been shallow all night, restless with what was to come. I dressed carefully, as if the act itself mattered. The suit hung loose on my shoulders, but it was pressed clean. The tie took me 3 tries before I got it right. My hands trembled more than they used to. When I finally looked in the mirror, I saw a man older than the boy I remembered raising, but steadier too, with lines carved not just from years but from choices. On the dresser sat the satchel. I lifted it, felt the heft of the folders inside. Proof of years no one wanted to speak of. Proof of sacrifices that had kept a roof over Michael's head, clothes on his back, a future within his reach. I thought again of my wife. Her photo on the nightstand caught the morning light, and for a moment it seemed like her eyes followed me, calm, unwavering. "I'll carry it right," I whispered. "I'll carry us both." By the time I stepped outside, the mist had lifted. The sun was climbing, already hot on my neck. From a distance, I could hear the faint hum of activity at the hall. Cars crunching on gravel, voices calling back and forth, the metallic clang of equipment being moved into place. I walked the property line first, slow and deliberate, as though reminding myself of where I belonged. Each fence post was familiar, each patch of earth carried memory. I thought of my father walking these same lines decades earlier, and his father before him. They had worked too hard to see our name dismissed as though it meant nothing. When I reached the corner that overlooked the venue, I stopped. Guests were beginning to arrive, stepping out of polished cars in bright dresses and pressed suits. Their laughter floated across the field, carried on the breeze. I watched as attendants guided them toward the rows of white chairs, toward the arch dripping with roses. From here, it looked beautiful, a painting almost, but I knew the soil under those roses, the sweat that had darkened it, the hands that had shaped it. I knew it because they were mine. I stayed there until my throat felt dry, then made my way back to the truck. The satchel rested on the passenger seat as I drove toward the hall, each turn of the wheels carrying me closer to the place I had been told not to enter. At the entrance, a young man in a rented tuxedo stopped me. He smiled politely, the way you do when you think you're speaking to a guest who's lost. "Excuse me, sir, are you on the list?" I met his gaze. "No, but the land is mine." He blinked, confused, then stepped aside as though instinct told him not to argue. I parked near the edge of the lot, away from the rows of gleaming cars. When I stepped out, the sun caught the gray in my hair, the lines on my face, the satchel at my side. A few heads turned. Not in recognition, but in curiosity. Inside, the hall buzzed with energy. Music from the string quartet drifted through the air. Guests clustered in small groups, laughing, sipping champagne, admiring the decorations. No one noticed me at first. To them, I was just another old man in a suit. But then Isabella saw me. She was radiant in her gown, standing near the arch, her parents at her side. Her smile froze, lips parting just slightly. She whispered something to her mother, who turned to look at me with eyes sharp as glass. I kept walking, each step slow, steady, deliberate. Not defiance, not apology, just presence. Michael appeared then, adjusting his tie, nerves plain on his face. When he saw me, his shoulders stiffened. His eyes flickered between me and Isabella, torn, unsure. "Dad," he began, but the word caught in his throat. I stopped a few feet from him, close enough for him to see the lines in my face, the truth in my eyes. "I came to wish you well," I said quietly, "and to stand on the land that is mine, nothing more, nothing less." He swallowed, unable to answer. Around us the guests hushed, sensing the weight in the air. The ceremony hadn't yet begun, but already the day had shifted. I could feel it, like a current pulling the river in a new direction. I placed the satchel gently on a nearby table, my hand resting on it, not opening it, not yet, just letting it sit there, a silent reminder. Then I straightened my tie, lifted my chin, and looked out at the rows of chairs. Dozens of faces stared back, curious, unsettled, some whispering. I didn't flinch, because this was my land, my truth, my history, and no invitation, or the absence of one, could strip that away. The music swelled, the officiant shuffled his notes, and the wedding began. The music began with a low hum from the quartet, strings drawing out the kind of notes that make people straighten in their seats. Guests quieted, settling into the rows of white chairs beneath the arch of roses. I stood at the back, near the shade of a tree, the satchel close by, my presence a shadow no one had expected. I watched as the bridal procession unfolded. Bridesmaids in pale lavender drifted down the aisle, their dresses catching the light like water. Groomsmen followed, stiff in their rented tuxedos. Then Isabella appeared, her arm looped through her father's, her gown a swirl of lace and silk. The guests gasped softly, the way people do when beauty walks into a room already set to admire it. Her eyes flicked once in my direction. Just once. Enough to send a shiver through her practiced smile. She turned away quickly, tightening her grip on her father's arm as though I were a storm cloud that might blot out the sun if she looked too long. Michael stood at the arch, waiting. He looked handsome, I'll admit it. The boy I'd raised had grown into a man, though in that moment he looked more like a boy again, nervous, uncertain, a flicker of fear in his eyes. His gaze darted toward me, then back to his bride, then down at his shoes. The officiant cleared his throat, his voice booming just enough to command attention. He welcomed the guests, spoke about love and union, about families joining together. The irony wasn't lost on me. Families joining together, and yet mine had been asked to vanish. I folded my hands in front of me, willing myself to stay quiet. I had promised myself I wouldn't disrupt, that I would only be here to stand in my truth. But as the words rolled on, honeyed and rehearsed, something inside me twisted. When it came time for vows, Isabella went first. Her voice was clear, strong, every word polished like glass. She spoke of loyalty, of laughter, of the life they would build. She mentioned her parents, her friends, the community that had shaped her into who she was today. Not a word about Michael's past, not a word about the family that had carried him here. Then Michael began. His voice shook at first but steadied as he went on. He spoke of devotion, of gratitude, of the way Isabella had changed his life. His words were sweet, tender, and yet hollow to me, because gratitude that ignores its roots is only half-truth. As he spoke, he glanced at me once. His lips trembled for a moment as though another word sat on the edge of his tongue but never made it past his teeth. Then he looked away, finishing his vow with a practiced smile. The officiant asked if anyone objected, the old formality that usually passed with silence. The crowd chuckled softly, expecting nothing but stillness. But silence is a heavy thing. It can strangle, it can erase. And I found I could not let it erase me. I stepped forward, slow, deliberate. A few guests turned, startled. The officiant's eyes widened. Isabella's grip tightened around Michael's hand, her knuckles white. "I don't object," I said, my voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "But I have something to give my son." A murmur rippled through the chairs. I reached for the satchel, the leather creaking as I opened it. From inside I drew a single folder, its edges crisp, its weight heavy with more than paper. I walked to the front, past rows of eyes that tracked me like I was a figure in a play no one had rehearsed for. When I reached Michael, I held the folder out to him. "This," I said quietly, "is the truth of where you stand today." Michael stared at the folder, his hand hovering but not taking it. The officiant shifted uncomfortably. Isabella whispered something sharp under her breath, but the words didn't reach me. "This land," I continued, my voice steady, "is mine, bought with the sweat of my father and his before him, paid for with nights I didn't sleep and years I gave away. Every brick in this hall, every rose in that arch stands on ground I carried. You may have forgotten, son, but the ground remembers." The silence deepened, pressing in on every ear. I could feel the weight of the guests' eyes, the shifting unease in their seats. I placed the folder on the table beside the officiant's book, then stepped back. My chest rose and fell, my hands trembling just slightly, not from fear but from release. "I don't object to your union," I said, softer now, "but don't ever build a life by pretending your roots don't exist, because roots," I looked toward the roses above, "are what hold everything upright when storms come." For a long moment no one moved. The air seemed to hum with something raw, something unsettled. Then the officiant cleared his throat again, fumbling for his place, trying to restore the ceremony to its neat path. But the path was no longer neat. The day had shifted. The truth had entered the room, and no string quartet could drown it out. I stepped back toward the shade of the tree, leaving the satchel still open on the table, its remaining folders untouched. They didn't need all of it, not yet. Just enough to remind them that I was here, that I had always been here. And as Michael lifted his bride's hand to slip on the ring, his eyes flicked toward me again. This time they lingered. Whispers rustled through the crowd like wind moving through tall grass. The string quartet faltered, their bows hovering midair before scraping back into a hesitant tune, as though music could patch over the rupture. It couldn't. The words I'd spoken had landed in the marrow of the day, and there was no undoing them. I saw the faces, neighbors, old friends, strangers in fine clothes. Some looked at me with surprise, others with something closer to respect, though they tried to hide it. A few turned away uneasy, unsure if siding with the truth meant shaming the bride's family. Isabella's parents were not subtle. Her mother leaned forward, lips thin, whispering furiously to her husband. He scowled in my direction, his jaw tight, the veins at his temple rising. To them, I wasn't just an uninvited guest. I was a crack in the flawless portrait they had painted for the town. Michael's hand trembled as he slid the ring onto Isabella's finger. His voice was softer now, almost lost to the murmurs as he repeated the words the officiant fed him. He didn't look at me, not directly, but I could feel him circling the weight of my presence like a man orbiting a fire he didn't know how to put out. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, the applause came weak, uneven. A handful clapped, others hesitated, as though the moment had been stripped of its sparkle. Isabella kissed Michael quickly, then pulled away, her eyes darting toward me with the sharpness of a blade. The recessional began. Guests rose from their chairs, the aisle filling with chatter, though it had lost its earlier shine. I stayed where I was beneath the shade, the satchel still on the table. I had said what I came to say. I had no need to move. But Isabella had other plans. She approached, her dress sweeping across the grass, her father at her side like a sentry. Michael trailed behind, caught between the two worlds that had just collided. "Mr. Flores," Isabella said, her voice taut but dipped in politeness, the way someone might speak to a man they wanted gone without a scene. "I think you've made your point, but this is our day. I would appreciate it if you left now before more damage is done." Her father stepped closer, his presence heavy. "You've embarrassed my daughter in front of our entire community," he said. "Haven't you done enough?" I met his eyes. "All I did was speak the truth." "Truth?" he snapped. This was supposed to be a wedding, not a courtroom. Michael finally spoke, his voice low. "Dad," I turned to him. "Son, I didn't come to ruin your day. I came to stand where I belong, on the land I gave my life to, on the ground that carried you long before today." His eyes flickered, torn. He wanted to agree, I could see it. But Isabella's hand gripped his, squeezing tight, pulling him back into her orbit. The guests were filing out now, some casting glances, others whispering behind hands. The atmosphere was brittle, ready to snap. I knew that if I stayed any longer, voices would rise, tempers would flare, so I picked up the satchel. The weight of the folders inside seemed heavier now, like stones carried from a riverbed. I held it close, looked once more at Michael, then nodded. "I'll go," I said quietly, "but the truth will stay with you." I walked past them, steady, not hurried. My shoes pressed into the earth, each step a reminder that I was leaving by choice, not by exile. Outside, the air felt cooler, though the sun was still high. The parking lot shimmered with the heat, guests climbing into cars, their conversations clipped and tense. A few nodded at me, hesitant but not unkind. One older man, a neighbor I'd known for decades, placed a hand briefly on my shoulder as he passed. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The gesture said enough. I reached my truck, set the satchel on the seat beside me, and sat with the door open, letting the air move through. My heart thudded heavy, but not with regret. No, regret belonged to those who forgot their roots. Through the windshield, I caught one last glimpse of the hall. Michael stood at the doorway, framed by the arch of roses, his new wife at his side. He looked out across the lot, his eyes finding mine even from a distance. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, almost imperceptibly, he lifted his hand, not a wave, not even a full gesture, just a small movement, uncertain, like a boy trying to remember how to reach for his father. I nodded once, then started the engine. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I pulled away, the sound sharp in the silence. The road stretched before me, long and winding, the fields rising on either side. The satchel rested quietly on the seat, the papers inside rustling as if alive. They weren't just documents anymore. They were reminders that dignity doesn't vanish because someone writes you out of a story. As I drove, I thought of what my wife would have said. She'd have smiled that knowing smile and whispered, "You stood tall, Dennis. That's all you ever needed to do." And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. Not joy, not yet, but a clearing, as though the storm that had gathered finally broke, leaving space for something else to grow. The wedding had ended without me in the picture frame, but the roots remained. And roots, I knew, outlast roses every time. The wedding was over, but the echoes lingered. In a town like ours, news moved faster than the river in flood season. By the next morning, whispers had grown legs, running from the diner to the post office to the hardware store. Everyone had heard some version of the story, that the father of the groom had stood up, that he'd claimed the land beneath the hall, that he'd left with a satchel full of papers. Some versions were kinder than others. At the diner, Marlene poured me coffee and shook her head. "You did what you had to, Dennis," she said quietly, almost as if granting permission. At the barber shop, I heard my name spoken with a mix of admiration and disdain. Some said I was brave for standing tall. Others muttered that I had embarrassed my own son on his wedding day. I kept my head down, but there's no hiding from a story once it takes root. 2 days later, the local paper arrived on my porch, folded neatly as always. But this time my name stared back at me from the front page. Wedding drama at Evergreen Hall. Groom's father interrupts ceremony. The article was sharp, almost cruel. It painted me as bitter, a man clinging to land as though it were his only worth. It quoted unnamed guests, people who claimed I had disrupted the joy of the day with selfish pride. What struck me most wasn't the slant of the words, but the tone. The writer didn't care for balance, didn't care for truth. It read like someone else's hand had guided the pen. I thought of Isabella's parents, their money, their connections. A call here, a favor there, and suddenly the story belonged to them. I sat at the kitchen table with the paper spread out before me, the ink smudging beneath my fingers. For a moment, the weight of it pressed heavy, as though the world itself had turned against me. But then I looked at the satchel on the chair beside me. The papers inside didn't bend to gossip. They didn't care for spin. They simply told the truth. And the truth, I decided, would not stay locked away. The next day I made copies. I drove to the library, to the same printer that had hummed for generations of students and job seekers. I fed each page carefully, listening to the steady rhythm of proof being born again. By noon, I had a dozen sets bound neatly, each one carrying the story the paper had tried to bury. I didn't knock on doors or shout from rooftops. Instead, I slipped the packets quietly into mailboxes, old friends, neighbors, people I trusted to read with clear eyes. I left one at the church, one at the diner, one at the post office bulletin board, not to start a war, just to let the truth breathe. By evening, the phone began to ring. Some calls I ignored. Others I answered, listening as voices I'd known for years said, "I never realized how much you'd done for Michael," or "That land has always been yours. Dennis, don't let anyone say different." Their words didn't erase the sting, but they steadied me. Meanwhile, the backlash began to turn. At the grocery store, I overheard two women whispering near the produce aisle. "They say the Flores land paid for that whole haul," one said. "And the father wasn't even invited. Lord, what kind of people treat family like that?" I walked past without saying a word, but my heart beat a little lighter. Not everyone was convinced, of course. Some clung to the story printed in black and white, preferring the polished version where I was the villain. But truth has a way of seeping into cracks, of finding ears willing to hear. I knew the article wouldn't be the last attempt to silence me. And I knew Isabella's family wouldn't forgive what they saw as a stain on their perfect day. But I also knew something had shifted in Michael. That night, as I sat on the porch, the phone buzzed. His name lit the screen. "Dad," he said when I answered, his voice low, tired. "I saw the paper. I saw it too. They twisted it, made it sound like you barged in, like you wanted to ruin everything." He paused, the silence between us thick. "I don't know what to believe anymore." "Believe what's in your hands," I said. "Believe the ground you stood on, it doesn't lie." He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have stood up for you, but I was afraid." My throat tightened. For years I'd waited for him to see me not as a wallet, not as a background figure, but as his father. "We'll talk," I said softly, "when you're ready." The call ended, but the night felt different after. The stars seemed clearer, the air easier to breathe. The paper had tried to bury me, but the truth had found its way out. And for the first time since that cold message on my phone weeks ago, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. Not for the world to see me differently, not for the town to sing my praises, but for my son to finally remember who he was and who I had always been. The week after the wedding felt like walking through smoke that refused to clear. The paper's version of events still clung to conversations in town, though the packets I'd sent had loosened the story's grip. People were beginning to see through it. But truth never travels as fast as scandal, and Isabella's family wasn't about to let their version go quietly. On Thursday, another article appeared, this one more pointed, less subtle. Flora's patriarch faces questions over motives. The headline read, "It accused me of seeking attention, of using property disputes to overshadow his son's future." It quoted a family insider who claimed I had always been bitter about Isabella's parents' wealth. I didn't need to guess who had whispered those words. The fingerprints of pride and money were all over it. I set the paper down, leaned back in my chair, and let the silence fill the room. Once those words might have pierced me, but now they only echoed against something stronger inside. You cannot shame a man who has lived his life in open daylight, who has receipts written into the soil itself. Still, I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about Michael. Each line printed about me was another stone laid at his feet, forcing him to choose which path to walk. That evening, the phone rang again. Michael's voice was hesitant, as though he wasn't sure whether he was calling as a son or as a man caught between two families. "Dad," he began, "things are tense here. Isabella's parents, they're furious. They say you've made them a laughingstock, that people are questioning their standing." "And what do you say?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear the faint sounds of a television in the background, muffled voices. Then he said, "I don't know, I just know it feels wrong to read lies about you." "Michael," I said gently, "a man can survive lies from strangers, but silence from his own blood, that cuts deeper." I heard him exhale, shaky. "I should have defended you, I wanted to, but standing there with everyone watching, I froze." I closed my eyes, imagining him as a boy again, standing on the edge of the high dive at the town pool, too scared to jump. Back then, I'd stood below, calling up to him, telling him I'd be there when he hit the water. He'd believed me, and he'd leapt. Now he was a grown man, but fear still chained him. "You don't have to fight their battles for them," I said. "But don't lose yourself trying to keep the peace. Peace built on silence doesn't last." The days turned restless. I noticed more than one car slowing near my house, drivers staring, curious if the man from the papers looked different in real life. At the diner, conversations hushed when I walked in, then picked back up once I left. A strange kind of fame, unwelcome and brittle. But at the same time, people began reaching out quietly. An old friend from the mill stopped by with a bag of apples, saying, "For what it's worth, you did right." A neighbor left a note in my mailbox. "Family isn't about who applauds you in public. It's about who stands with you when the lights go out." These small gestures mattered. They reminded me I wasn't alone, that even if the louder voices belonged to Isabella's parents, the steadier ones belonged to people who knew the ground beneath their feet. One night just past dusk, a car pulled into my drive. It was Michael's. He sat there for a long time before stepping out, the headlights throwing long shadows across the yard. "I shouldn't be here," he said when he finally reached the porch. "Isabella thinks I'm staying late at work." "You're always welcome here," I answered. He sat down heavily, staring out at the fields. For a while, neither of us spoke. The night hummed with crickets, the smell of earth rising cool after the heat of the day. At last, he said, "I've been thinking about that day, about what you said. And I can't shake it. You were right about the land, about roots. I didn't want to hear it then, but I can't build a life pretending you're not part of it." I looked at him, the boy I had raised, now caught in the tug-of-war between love and pride, between truth and appearances. "Son," I said, my voice rough, "you don't have to choose between me and her family, but you do have to choose yourself. Decide what kind of man you'll be, one who hides from the truth or one who stands with it." His hands curled into fists on his knees. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," I said firmly. "You always were, you just forgot." He left before midnight, his headlights sweeping across the yard as he drove away. I watched until the night swallowed the glow. Inside, I sat with the satchel again, running my hands over the worn leather. I didn't know what battles still lay ahead, what stories would be spun next. But I knew this: truth is patient. It waits. It weathers storms. And sooner or later, even the strongest walls of silence begin to crack. And in that crack, light always finds its way through. The following week, the temperature in town seemed to shift, though the weather remained the same. Conversations that had once carried easy laughter now held an edge. I felt it in the way people paused before greeting me, the way they weighed their words as if every sentence might be repeated elsewhere. The story had grown beyond the wedding. It had become a measuring stick, forcing folks to choose where they stood. At the grocery store, two women by the canned goods glanced at me, their voices pitched just high enough for me to hear. "It's disgraceful," one said. "Embarrassing your own son like that." The other shook her head. "Or maybe it's the son who should be embarrassed, asking for everything, giving nothing back." I kept walking, the cart squeaking beneath my hands. That was the way of it. Some saw a villain, others saw a man who had simply spoken aloud what many lived quietly. But behind the gossip, I sensed something deeper stirring, and that's when the second article appeared. This one didn't just question my motives, it attacked my character. It called me a disruptive influence, accused me of harboring resentment and seeking to undermine the marriage from the start. There were quotes attributed to close family sources claiming I had threatened to withdraw financial help unless I was given a prominent seat at the ceremony. Lies, crafted with precision. I read the words slowly, each one like grit on my tongue. The paper trembled in my hands, not from weakness, but from the knowledge that Isabella's parents weren't finished. They wanted me discredited completely, turned into a cautionary tale of bitterness. Later that day, Michael called. His voice carried a strain I hadn't heard before, tight as a rope pulled too far. "Dad, I didn't say those things," he blurted the moment I answered. "I swear I didn't. They're twisting everything." "I know," I said calmly. "You believe me?" "I do." There was silence, thick with relief. Then he said quieter, "Her parents, they're furious. They said they won't rest until everyone knows you're unstable." "Do you believe them?" I asked. He hesitated. I could hear the conflict in his breathing. "No, but it's hard, Dad. They make everything sound so certain. They talk like truth is just whatever they print." "Truth isn't ink," I said. "It's stone. And stone doesn't change because someone paints over it." A few nights later, Michael came to the house again. This time he didn't park at the edge of the drive. He pulled right up, headlights washing over the porch. When he climbed out, his shoulders sagged, exhaustion written in every line of his body. Inside, he sat at the table where his mother's photograph still stood. He looked at it a long time before speaking. "I feel like I'm being split in half," he admitted. "On one side, Isabella's parents telling me you're trying to ruin us. On the other, you standing there with the truth in your hands. I don't know how to live between the two." I leaned forward, my hands clasped. "You don't have to live between them, son. You choose where to stand. And once you do, the noise on the other side won't matter so much." He looked down, his voice a whisper. "What if choosing cost me everything? My marriage, my home?" "Then you'll know what kind of foundation those things were built on," I said. "If they can't survive the truth, they were never meant to last." His eyes filled with something unspoken, fear, maybe, or recognition. The turning point came quietly. A neighbor stopped by with a casserole, the kind of gesture that looks small but carries weight. She said she'd heard enough to know the paper had twisted the story, and that people were beginning to question who was really behind the words. Word spread, not through headlines but through whispers and glances, through the way folks chose which side of the street to walk on when passing Isabella's parents. Their perfect image had begun to crack, not with a bang but with the slow erosion of doubt. And Michael felt it too. He called more often, sometimes with nothing to say, just to hear my voice. I could sense him leaning, testing the ground beneath him, realizing it might hold after all. One evening, as we sat on the porch together, he asked, "Do you regret it, Dad, speaking up that day?" I thought of the silence that might have been, of watching my son take vows on land that carried my name while I stood invisible at the edges. "No," I said. "I regret that it came to that. I regret that you didn't feel strong enough to speak it yourself, but standing quiet would have been worse." He nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to see that." The crickets sang in the tall grass, the night pressing close around us. For the first time in years, I felt not just the distance between us, but the bridge beginning to form. Fragile, yes, but real. And as the stars broke open across the sky, I knew the fight wasn't over. Isabella's family would not step back quietly. They would push harder, claw deeper. But now, for the first time, I wasn't the only one carrying the weight of truth. The shift in Michael was subtle at first, like a man learning to use muscles he hadn't realized were there. He started calling more often, not just at night when the house was quiet, but in the middle of the day. Sometimes it was just to ask about fixing a leaky faucet or to remind me of a memory from his childhood. Small things, but they carried weight. They were cracks in the wall Isabella's family had worked so hard to build around him, But cracks invite pressure, and pressure came swiftly. One evening just before dusk I heard a car pull into the drive. Not Michael's. A sleek black sedan, windows tinted darker than glass had any right to be. When the door opened, Isabella's father stepped out, followed by his wife. They were dressed too sharply for the country air, polished leather shoes, pearls that caught the fading light. I met them on the porch, arms folded, not out of hostility but because I needed the strength of my own stance. "Mr. Flores," her father began, his voice smooth but edged. "We thought it best to speak face to face." His wife tilted her chin up, her eyes scanning the house as if measuring its worth. "This has gone too far," she said. "Your interruptions, your attempts to sway Michael, it's undermining their marriage. Our family will not tolerate it." I let the words hang in the air before answering. "The only thing undermining a marriage is lies. If truth feels like a threat, perhaps you should ask why." Her father's smile thinned. "You're a stubborn man. But stubbornness doesn't carry much weight when the community sees you as disruptive. We have resources, Mr. Flores. Influence. If you continue this crusade, don't think for a second you'll come out unscathed." I leaned against the porch rail, steady. "I've already lived through harder storms than your threats. You can't erase what I've built, and you can't buy roots with money. Michael knows that, whether he admits it to you or not." His eyes flickered, the mask slipping for just a breath. He hated that word, roots, because it was something he couldn't purchase, something his family tree couldn't counterfeit. They left soon after, their car rolling down the drive like a dark shadow receding. But I knew they weren't finished. People like that never leave a fight half won. The next blow came in whispers. At the bank, the teller, who'd known me since Michael was a boy, looked uneasy as she handed me my withdrawal slip. "There's been talk," she murmured, glancing over her shoulder, "that you're falling behind on payments, that maybe the land isn't as secure as folks thought." I felt heat rise in my chest. Lies again, carefully planted. If they couldn't erase the deed, they would try to sow doubt about it. Doubt spreads faster than truth when fed to the right ears. That evening Michael showed up, his face pale, his hands restless. "They told me you're in trouble financially," he blurted. "That the land might go into default. Is it true?" I almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "No, son. The land is solid, paid and steady. That rumor is just another trick." He sank into the porch chair, pressing his palms against his eyes. "They make everything sound so convincing. They talk like the whole world agrees with them." I reached over, rested a hand on his shoulder. "That's their power, Michael. Not truth, not roots. Just noise, loud enough to drown out what's real if you let it. But you have to listen deeper, to yourself." He nodded, but the weight on him didn't lift. He was caught in their net even as he reached for me. The breaking point came at church the following Sunday. It wasn't planned, at least not by me. I had slipped into a pew near the back, as I always did, content to listen and leave quietly. But when the pastor spoke about integrity, about standing in the truth even when it costs, I felt every word strike the air between us like a hammer. And then I saw Michael. He was seated near the front, Isabella at his side, her parents in their polished finery. His head was bowed, but not in prayer. His hands were clenched, his shoulders taut. When the service ended, he stood before they could stop him. He turned, eyes sweeping the congregation, then landing on me. "My father isn't a liar," he said, voice unsteady but loud enough to carry. "He's the reason I'm standing here. Every rumor, every article, they don't tell the truth, but I will." Gasps rippled through the pews. Isabella tugged at his arm, her parents stiff as statues. But Michael didn't stop. He spoke of the land, of the years I had carried him after his mother died, of the quiet sacrifices no one had ever seen. He spoke until his voice cracked, until the silence in the church was so deep you could hear the rafters creak. When he finished, he turned to me, eyes wet. "I should have said this sooner. I'm sorry, Dad." The room was frozen. Isabella's parents looked carved from stone, their faces pale with rage. But around them people shifted, nodding, whispering. The tide had begun to turn, not with my words, but with his. That night he came to the house again. He didn't say much, just sat beside me on the porch, our silence filled with something new, recognition, reconciliation, the fragile beginning of a bridge built on truth. And though I knew Isabella's parents would come harder now, sharper, more desperate to hold their image, I also knew this. For the first time, my son was standing beside me. And that changed everything. The week after Michael's stand in church, the town seemed to shift again. For the first time, people approached me openly, not in whispers or with cautious glances, but with firm nods and quiet affirmations. At the diner, Marlene set down my coffee and said, "Your boy spoke with courage, Dennis. You should be proud." At the feed store, an old farmer clapped me on the shoulder and muttered, "Truth's got a way of sprouting even in rocky ground." But truth, once it sprouts, draws weeds, and the weeds came fast. Isabella's parents weren't built for losing face. The day after church, another article appeared, this time not in the local paper but in a larger regional one. The headline was blunt, almost cruel: "Estranged father sows discord at son's wedding." The story painted me as a relic, a bitter man clinging to land because he had nothing else. It said Michael had grown beyond the shadow of a domineering father, and that the scene at the wedding had been nothing more than an unseemly grab for attention. I read it slowly, the words burning like acid. The reach was larger now, beyond our town into neighboring counties. Isabella's parents weren't just fighting me here. They were trying to write a version of me into the world that would stick long after I was gone. That night Michael came over again, his face pale with anger, slapped the paper down on the table. "They won't stop, Dad. They'll drag you through every headline they can buy." I looked at him carefully. "And what will you do?" His jaw tightened. "I won't let them do it, not anymore." The next day I saw what he meant. At the hardware store, Michael spoke loudly enough for people to hear. "That article's lies. My father built everything I have. Don't believe a word they print." At the post office, he stood in line talking to neighbors, his voice steady, repeating the truth I had carried alone for so long. It was small, maybe, just words in passing, but in a town like ours, words in passing travel like wildfire. By evening, I could feel the difference. A few folks stopped by the house, not with casseroles or apples this time, but with stories. One neighbor told me how Isabella's mother had pressured her into signing a letter to the editor, but she had refused. Another said the paper had called, fishing for quotes that would smear me further. The fight was no longer just mine. Others were starting to resist the noise. Isabella's parents, though, doubled down. They hosted a dinner at their home, inviting half the town's leaders, businessmen, council members, anyone who might help keep their version of events alive. I wasn't there, of course, but word of it reached me the next day. They paraded that article like scripture, a friend told me, shaking his head. But it didn't land the way they wanted. People are tired of the show. Too polished, too rehearsed. Doesn't ring true. For the first time, I realized the power of what had happened in church. My words at the wedding had stirred the pot, yes. But Michael's words, public, raw, unpolished, had cut through the gloss. People believed him because they knew the look of a son speaking from his gut. And that, I understood, was what Isabella's parents feared most. Not me. Him. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Michael came by again. He didn't sit this time. He paced the porch, restless, his hands running through his hair. "They want me to sign a statement," he said abruptly. "Something formal, saying you've been unstable for years, that you pressured me into speaking at church. They're saying if I don't, they'll cut off help with the mortgage, with the car, with everything." I studied him, the boy I had raised now standing at the edge of manhood. "And what will you do?" He stopped pacing, turned toward me. His face was pale, but his voice steady. "I won't sign it. I don't care what it costs." For a moment the air between us felt charged, alive with something I hadn't felt in years: solidarity. The kind a father hopes for but never demands. "You'll stand taller for it," I said quietly, "even if they strip everything else away." Later that night I sat alone on the porch, listening to the crickets hum. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was entering its hardest stretch. Isabella's parents weren't finished, and their reach extended farther than I could see. But for the first time, I didn't feel alone in the storm. My son had chosen his ground. Not perfectly, not without fear, but chosen nonetheless. And sometimes one choice is all it takes to turn the tide. The threats came not in raised voices, but in envelopes. Thick ones, stamped and sealed, slid into my mailbox with the quiet precision of a knife. The first was a letter from a law office in the city. Formal, heavy with words meant to intimidate. It alleged disturbance of contract, interference with business operations, even hinted at emotional damages tied to my presence at the wedding. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and set it on the kitchen table. Words on paper, nothing more, but they weren't meant for the truth. They were meant to exhaust me, to wear me down until I bent. The second envelope came 2 days later, this one addressed not to me but to Michael. He brought it straight over, his face pale, his hands shaking as he held it out. Inside was a cold promise: if he continued to associate with false narratives, financial support from Isabella's parents would vanish. The car payments, the rent stipends, the whispered safety nets, they would all be cut. Michael sat at my table, staring at the letter as if it might burn through the wood. "They're serious," he said quietly. "If I stand with you, it's all gone." I looked at him, the boy I'd raised now wrestling with the weight of manhood. "Then you'll find out what you're made of," I said. "A man doesn't discover himself when the ground is soft. He discovers it when the ground shakes beneath him." That night we sat on the porch together, the air heavy with summer heat. Michael's eyes were tired, but there was something in them I hadn't seen in years: resolve. "They think I can't live without them," he muttered. "That I'll bend because they hold the purse strings." "Do you believe that?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "No, I don't, but it scares me, Dad. I've leaned on their help more than I should have. I let it happen, and now I feel like I'm starting from nothing." "You're not starting from nothing," I told him. "You're starting from truth. That's worth more than anything they can buy." He nodded, the words sinking in like seeds dropped into soil, fragile but alive. 2 days later, another blow landed. At the diner, Marlene slipped me a folded note, her eyes wary. "They're pushing harder," she whispered. Inside was a copy of a petition circulating quietly around town, drafted by Isabella's father. It called for a review of my lease agreement, suggesting that my presence on the property made me unfit to continue as landlord. The language was slippery, but the intent was clear. If they couldn't silence me with articles, they'd try to rip the land itself from beneath my feet. I drove home with the paper on the passenger seat, the weight of it pressing heavier than the satchel ever had. But anger didn't rise in me, not this time. What rose instead was a clarity, sharp and cold. They were showing their hand, and in showing it they revealed their fear. That evening Michael came by again. He'd heard about the petition. He didn't look shaken this time, he looked furious. "They can't take the land, Dad. Tell me they can't." "They can't," I said simply. "The deed's solid, paid in full. They can throw noise and paper at us, but stone is stone." He exhaled, the fight draining from him. "Then we fight back." We spent hours at the table going over the folders, the receipts, the agreements. Michael listened carefully as I explained each line, each clause, each piece of proof. For the first time I wasn't carrying it alone. He took notes, asked questions, his brow furrowed with focus. At one point he looked up at me and said, "All those years I thought you were just quiet, that you didn't care to explain. But you weren't quiet. You were carrying all this." I met his eyes. "I carried it so you didn't have to, but maybe I should have shown you sooner." We let the silence sit then, not heavy this time, but full of something that felt like healing. By the time Michael left, the night was thick with stars. He paused at the truck, turning back to me. "Dad," he said, "if they push this to court, if they try to drag you through more, we'll stand," I said, "together." For the first time since this all began, his shoulders lifted as if the weight wasn't his alone. He nodded, climbed into the truck, and drove off into the dark. I stayed on the porch long after, listening to the cicadas, the night alive around me. The fight wasn't finished, not by a long shot. But there was a new strength in me, one I hadn't felt since my wife was alive. Because now, when the storm came, and I knew it would, I wouldn't be standing in it alone. The letters turned into filings. A notice came by certified mail, stamped in bold red, pending legal review. It was their latest weapon, dressed in the armor of official language. Isabella's parents had moved beyond rumor and petitions. They had carried their fight into the courts. I read the notice at the kitchen table, the morning sun spilling across the paper. Its words were cold, clinical, allegations of breach, claims of emotional distress, even a request for compensatory damages, all dressed to look legitimate, but I could see the cracks. There was no case, not in substance, but sometimes the weight of process is punishment enough. They wanted me buried in hearings and fees, drained until I bent. Michael came that afternoon, a storm still in his eyes. He slapped the notice down on the table. "This isn't just noise anymore. They want to break you." "They won't," I said simply. He paced the room, fists clenching and unclenching. "I can't believe I let them get this far. I should have stood up sooner. I should have." I cut him off. "Son, regret's a heavy load. Don't carry it now. Carry resolve instead." The following days became a blur of preparation. I dug deeper into the satchel, pulling every document I'd ever saved: tax receipts, property surveys, notarized leases, canceled checks. I spread them across the table like puzzle pieces, each one a piece of my life. Michael sat with me, notebook in hand, writing as I spoke. He asked questions, listened, pushed where he didn't understand. For the first time, I saw him not just as my boy, but as a man beginning to stand in the weight of truth. At one point, he held up an old carbon copy of a check, the ink faded but still legible. "You paid for the hall repairs 5 years ago." I nodded. "Roof leaked after a storm. The management company was too slow to act. If I hadn't stepped in, the place would have rotted." He shook his head, almost in disbelief. "They've built their empire on your back, Dad, and they've been trying to erase it all along." I looked at him carefully. "Now you see." The town watched from the sidelines, their whispers louder than ever. Some said I was foolish for not letting go, for dragging the fight into the open. Others said it was about time someone stood up to Isabella's parents. The divide wasn't clean, but the current was shifting. At the diner, Marlene leaned close when she poured my coffee. "Don't let them wear you down, Dennis. You've got more folks behind you than you think." At church, Father Mark shook my hand, his grip firm. "The truth doesn't fear the courtroom," he said quietly. "Stand steady." These voices mattered, not because they changed the fight, but because they reminded me I wasn't walking it alone. One evening, after hours of sorting papers, Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "Dad," he said, "when Mom was alive, did you two ever imagine it would come to this? That family would turn into—" He trailed off, searching for the word. I looked at his mother's picture on the shelf, her smile frozen in time. I said softly, "She believed love was strong enough to carry anything, and maybe it is, but love without respect, that's like planting in barren soil, nothing grows." Michael was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wish she were here, she'd know how to cut through all of this." "She is here," I answered. "In you, in me, in every choice we make to stand instead of bow." The first hearing was scheduled for the following month. A courthouse in the next county, neutral ground. Paperwork listed dates, times, requirements, bureaucracy in black ink. When I finished reading it, I folded it neatly and set it aside. Fear didn't come, not anymore. What came instead was a kind of calm, like standing in the eye of a storm, knowing it would rage, but also knowing I would not move. Michael looked at me across the table, his face pale but resolute. "I'll be there, Dad, every step." I nodded. "This isn't just my fight anymore. It's ours." That night I stepped outside alone. The field stretched wide in the moonlight, silver and endless. The hall sat in the distance, its lights dark now, its silence thick. I thought of the day Michael had stood in church, his voice cracking but firm. I thought of the porch conversations, the letters, the threats. And I thought of the soil beneath my feet, older than all of us, steady as stone. The fight was far from over. Isabella's parents would push harder, claw deeper, desperate to hold their story together. But they had made one mistake. In trying to break me, they had bound me closer to my son. And that bond, I knew, was something no court, no article, no lie could undo. The courthouse smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of place where lives get folded into files and argued over in voices that echo too loudly. I had never set foot there before, not for myself. Walking through those doors, satchel in hand, I felt both small and unshakable. Small because the walls were tall and the system bigger than any one man. Unshakable because I carried the truth, and it didn't bend with the weather. Michael walked beside me. He wore the same suit he'd married in, though it looked different on him now, less like fabric chosen for a show, more like armor he decided to wear. His steps were heavy but steady. When he glanced at me, there was no hesitation left in his eyes, just resolve. Inside, Isabella's parents were already seated with their lawyers. They didn't look at me. Her father tapped a pen against his folder, his jaw set in stone. Her mother sat upright, her pearls gleaming under the fluorescent light, her lips pressed tight. For them, this wasn't just about contracts or land. It was about power, and I had cracked the picture they'd painted of themselves. The judge entered and everyone rose. My hands didn't tremble as I set the satchel on the table. I had touched those papers too many times, traced the ink of my name, felt the weight of history in every fold. They weren't just exhibits, they were my life. Their lawyer spoke first, words sharp as knives, polished with the sheen of money. He painted me as a disruptive presence, a bitter father clinging to property because he had nothing else. He spoke of emotional trauma Isabella's family had endured, of how my outburst at the wedding had jeopardized the sanctity of the day. I let him talk. Noise can fill a room, but noise isn't substance. When he finished, the judge looked to me. I stood. My knees felt the years, but my voice did not. I didn't come here to ruin a wedding, I said. I came because my son was about to begin his life on soil that carried more than roses and chairs. It carried the sweat of his grandfather, the hands of his grandmother, the labor of his mother and me. They told me not to come as if I were a stranger. But you cannot unwrite roots. You cannot erase truth with invitations or with ink on paper. I reached into the satchel, laying down the deeds, the tax receipts, the lease agreements one by one. The stack grew, each page a stone, each stone a foundation. This isn't pride, I continued. It's record, it's fact. I carried this land so my son could stand taller than me. And I will not let anyone tell him it was built by people who only showed up when the ground was already level. The room was silent when I finished. Even their lawyer had no quick retort. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. Michael stood. His hands shook, but his voice carried. "My father is right," he said. "I was too afraid to admit it before, but I wouldn't be here, not in this marriage, not in this town, not in this life if it weren't for him. Every dollar of my education, every roof I've lived under, every piece of stability I've had, it came from his sacrifice. And I forgot that. Or maybe I let myself forget because it was easier to believe the stories told around me." He swallowed hard, then continued louder. "But I won't forget anymore. He didn't ruin my wedding. He gave me the ground to stand on. And if that truth feels inconvenient, it's because it exposes how shallow the rest has been." The words hung in the air, heavier than any legal argument. The judge leaned back, studying us both, then turned to the pile of documents. He flipped through them slowly, the sound of paper crisp in the hushed room. Finally, he spoke. "The deed is clear. The lease is valid, and the presence of a landowner at a ceremony on his own property does not constitute disruption of contract. These claims," he tapped the lawyer's folder, "have no standing." A gavel struck wood. Final. Isabella's parents stiffened, their faces a mix of fury and disbelief. Her father muttered something under his breath. Her mother gathered her pearls as though they could shield her from the truth. They rose quickly, avoiding our eyes, and left the room. Their exit was quieter than their entrance, and emptier too. Michael stayed seated beside me, his head bowed. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red but his expression clear. "Dad," he whispered, "I'm sorry it took this much for me to see." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "What matters is that you see now. Life after court wasn't suddenly easy. Rumors don't die overnight, and pride doesn't crumble in a single judgment. Isabella's parents withdrew from the spotlight for a while, but I knew their bitterness would smolder. Still, the town saw what had happened. The articles lost their sting. The truth had walked into a courtroom and walked back out standing tall. Michael came around more often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to sit on the porch in silence. He asked questions about his mother, about our family, about the years he had been too young to remember. Slowly, we built something new between us, not the innocence of the past, but the honesty of the present. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, Michael said, "I want to start paying into the land. Not just working it, but owning my share. I don't want to live on borrowed ground anymore. I want to build with you." It was the kind of sentence that makes an old man's chest ache in the best way. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the horizon, the same fields I'd walked for decades, and felt the weight of generations pressing not down but forward. "You're ready now," I said finally. That's all I ever wanted. The hall still stood at the far end of the property, its white walls gleaming under the summer sun. Weddings still took place there, laughter still carried across the fields, but it no longer felt like a place that erased me. It felt like ground that had been claimed not by force but by truth. Sometimes I'd see guests wandering outside, admiring the land, never knowing the fight it had carried. And I'd smile quietly because I knew, Michael knew, and that was enough. When I look back on it now, I don't think of the text message that began it, or even the articles that tried to bury me. I think of the moment my son stood in church, voice cracking but finally telling the truth. I think of the courthouse where generations stood on paper and on earth unshaken. And I think of the porch where silence no longer felt like distance but like peace. Roots endure. Roses bloom and wither, headlines flare and fade, but roots stay. And if there's anything this story has taught me, it's that family, when it chooses to stand in truth, can survive storms that pride alone cannot. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it moved you, if it reminded you of your own roots, I hope you'll carry that truth forward in your own life. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story we share together. Wishing you health, peace, and the warmth of family always by your side.